Hi and welcome to Why is Being Fashionable a Pretty Modern Concept? Now don't get me wrong, fashion existed for thousands of years and wearing fashionable clothes is nothing new. But I think the whole concept of being fashionable is something completely different now than it was in the 19th century and 18th century in the medieval times. First of all, Western fashion was always very closely related to your social status. So for centuries, fashion was strictly reserved for the most rich and the most important. In fact, it was so important for the rich people and the most important people that fashion is something that only belongs to them, that they actually implemented laws which were called the sumptuary laws, to literally prevent the poorer people from being fashionable. That meant that even if you were a rich merchant or a wealthy person that wasn't related to aristocracy or was not an important church person, you still couldn't wear the fashionable clothing even if you could afford them. And that was to kind of draw the line between the highest class and the lower classes, or the rest of the classes really. All this is more of a medieval to 17th century thing, but some sumptuary laws actually still existed in like mid 18th century in Europe. And it's also important to note that up until late 18th century, fashion varied from country to country, from city to city. There was a lot more variety of it. So that meant there was not a single way of being fashionable. Like, there was no way for a single person to be universally fashionable. You could be like the fanciest, the richest lady in 16th century Switzerland, but if you went to Paris or Madrid, all of a sudden you would look out of place and your clothes would be kind of weird and your hot fit wouldn't be that hot anymore, which was pretty sad, I must say. Like, imagine spending all your money on fancy clothes and then you go somewhere else and people are like, Deborah, what are you wearing? And before mid-18th century, fashion was also a lot slower. Like, it just changed a lot slower. Of course, you had new fabrics and new decoration and new trends, but the way the news circulated didn't allow a fast international flow of information. So it wasn't that unusual to be stuck on like one or two main dress models. For example, the Mantua dress in the late 17th century, robe volant of the early 18th century, and the only thing that changed was like patterns on the fabric or decoration, but the general silhouette remained the same for like decades. With the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution as well, the reign of the aristocracy wasn't so obvious anymore. Like, they weren't the only people that had something important to say. And the growing middle class had a lot more to say when it came to what they wanted to wear and what they could wear. So from around 1770s, fashion began to change at a much faster pace. You had new trends and new patterns and new dresses that appeared on a regular basis, and the fashionable silhouette changed more or less every year. Now, here's something worth mentioning, and that's true for a lot of the fashion history eras, that while not all of the classes could afford the most expensive and fashionable clothes, the main fashionable silhouette remained the same for pretty much everyone. For example, just because you were a street seller in 1805 London, that didn't mean that you were gonna wear an 18th century style dress. You just had your outfit made from poorer fabrics, and you probably wouldn't have all the fancy accessories, but like the main silhouette of your outfit would remain more or less fashionable. And the way poorer people achieved that, but that was also very common in the middle class, and actually some aristocratic families also did this, is that you adjusted your clothing. So you just changed the cut of your clothing to make it more fashionable. For example, if you had a lot of fabric in the skirt and suddenly more narrow skirts were fashionable, you would just adjust the skirt so it looks more fashionable. It wasn't that difficult, to be honest. So if you look at the photos of 19th century and 20th century working class or poorer people, you can notice that a lot of them are pretty close when it comes to the fashionable silhouette. They're literally just like 1 year or 2 years behind. It's just that the clothing is a lot more simple, but a lot of them follow the fashionable silhouette quite closely. Why did they care about following the fashionable silhouette even if they were poor? Like, it didn't really affect the quality of their lives, or did it? So here's the thing, being fashionable in the 19th century meant the exact opposite that it means now. It meant following the rules and perfectly blending in. People were so obsessed with the idea of following the etiquette and propriety, that you had to be really, really bold or a member of royal family basically to try and establish your own trends. So experimenting or defying the mainstream silhouette meant that either you didn't understand the importance of fitting in, or you were sloppy, or you couldn't afford being fashionable and fitting in the fashionable silhouette, or that you were basically a hoe. Now, in the world where literally the smallest spot on your crystal clear reputation could literally ruin your life, I don't think there were many people that wanted to risk that, to be honest. I'm currently reading Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence, which takes place in 1871, I think. And there's this moment when a female character leans over in the theater lodge, and it is noted that her dress kind of slipped from her shoulders and a little bit too much of her boobage was shown. And that leads to some characters reacting negatively to her later. So if something as small as a wardrobe malfunction could literally kill your social life, you had to be truly, really extravagant to risk that. And this, of course, doesn't mean that there were no people that risked that, obviously. Like, fashion was built on breaking rules and taboos and risking it, basically. And there is a lot of iconic characters that shifted fashion throughout the ages. But it just means that being fashionable meant something completely different to them. When I reviewed costumes in Enola Holmes a while ago, and I noted that Mrs. Harrison's clothes were a little bit anachronistic for 1880s, some of you commented that maybe she didn't want to follow the newest trends because of how strict and uptight she was. But to be honest, this is exactly why she would want to dress fashionably in the 1880s. We tend to think of fashion as something risky and controversial that only the bravest adapt and care about. And that could be the case nowadays. But back then, being fashionable meant maintaining your reputation and showing that you were capable of following social norms, and doing that with perhaps some class and a little creative input, but nothing more. So it could seem strange from nowadays' perspective, because nowadays I feel like most fashionable people are the ones that constantly invent something new and break the rules and create their own rules and draw inspiration from different eclectic places and are a bit unexpected in a way. But for most of fashion history, being elegant was basically, it meant the same as being fashionable. Why? Because fashion wasn't invented for young people, basically. Fashion was designed for grown-ups, usually the married grown-ups, and everyone else just wore lame variations of their styles. For example, Victorian girls wore basically what their mothers wore at the time, except it was shorter and less fancy. And it wasn't until 1960s when young people, especially teenagers, started to take over fashion, basically. So suddenly the teenagers were fashionable and everyone else felt left behind because suddenly they didn't belong to this secret fashion club. Late 60s fashion basically broke the rules of elegance that have ruled the world of fashion since basically forever. Well, at least for decades. What about the people that chose to wear old styles on purpose? Well, that was a very popular choice for old people. It was generally agreed that older women should not be that interested in modern and newest trends because that made it a little bit suspicious, like, you're already married, shouldn't you be like a matron or something? So they usually wore trends that were a little bit or completely out of style, and nobody cared about that. But the concept of wearing vintage, as in actually wearing old clothes, didn't really exist until 1970s. Before that, you would wear, oh my god, so many pigeons out of nowhere. Before that, you would wear clothes that were inspired by a certain historical style, but it would still be a modern silhouette. For example, in 1870s, there was a boom for historical trends implemented in the daily clothing. You had Renaissance-inspired sleeves or 18th century-inspired necklines and decoration. 1850s evening gowns drew a lot of inspiration from Rococo period, while early 19th century styles were heavily inspired by classical sculptures. But as you can notice, it was never trends from a decade or two before. It was usually pretty old stuff. And also it was modern clothes following particular trends or drawing inspiration from previous eras, but the cut and the silhouette remained completely modern. So it wasn't until 1970s when a lot of fashion rules were broken, when people started digging out the old stuff, for example, Belle Epoque cotton dresses or 1930s clothing, and actually wearing it unironically on a day-to-day basis. So this is really only the tip of the whole what is fashion and what fashion was through centuries iceberg, but I hope it did clear out some of the ideas you might have about what women thought about being fashionable and what was considered fashionable. But of course it's a very complicated topic, and it varies from country to country, and you know, each era probably had different ideas about being fashionable. You know, for most of history, being too overtly fashionable was also considered improper. Like, if you were too much into fashion, if you were too immodest, let's say, by following the newest fashions obsessively, you would probably be labeled as a coquette, or I don't know, some other derogatory term for a fashionable woman. But it just shows that no matter what women do, there would always be someone criticizing them for it. I don't know. I don't really know how to end this video. It's really just an intro to how we think about the past, because a lot of the times we apply modern standards and modern thoughts to people living 200 years ago, and we're like, why were they so irrational? But, you know, we can't do that. It was a completely different mindset. So, yeah. Anyway, I'ma go. Bye.